Hey everyone, it's GM Josh Fidel. I wanted to do a video today about decision making in the opening. This came about because I was watching some games from the World Open, which is going on Saturday, the 6th, I guess, at night, and I was watching a bunch of openings play out, and I'm like, you know what, this would be a cool thing to do a video on. In general, I don't do tons of opening videos, mainly because everyone plays different openings, and if I do a video about one opening, it's not as universally applicable. And then you know, and then whereas if I do other topics, it kind of applies to everyone. But at the same time, it is an important phase of the game. So I thought I would do a few questions about opening decision making. Uh, so the main thing I wanted to focus on was how to make different choices in the opening. Not so much the individual openings themselves. I chose four examples that occurred in just the last round of this tournament, which I happened to spot, right? I was just playing through the games, and these were moments I thought were significant. So this is one. Um, some of these games include some very talented players. And talented player here was playing black. I think it was young Tani, actually. You should probably know who that is at this point. But in any case, so he was black here, and he had to make a choice between, he has a bunch of developing moves, but I'm going to do something which I've done in actually some of my courses. If you'd like to check them out, my Chessable courses, there's a link below in the description. But what I do is, rather than just give you an open choice, I give you two options to choose between, and one option is often not as good. So here we can start with this position. So between bishop e6 and bishop g7, I'll have you make the decision first, and then I'll kind of go into my preamble and how all of this works. So just decide which move you would play, bishop e6 or bishop g7. So decisions like this come up all the time, and people have trouble making choices like this because it's like the moves look kind of similar. Both moves develop a bishop, both moves clearly improve your position. How could they possibly be so different? And I find that the reason people struggle with these things is because mainly people are thinking about what setup they want. I want this setup, I want my bishop on e6, my bishop on g7, my knight on e7, and I castle. What's the difference? And usually the difference is how your opponent is set up, what your opponent is capable of doing. And people forget their opponents all the time. They just do not pay attention to what their opponent's doing. They don't pay attention to their opponent's setup. And it's one of the most common mistakes I see. People learn openings, especially at lower levels, I would say, under expert or whatever you want to call it, right? Like not even that low levels, right? People learn openings, I've taught masters who do this, where they learn openings based on setups. And it's all well and good until you realize that chess is a game played between two people. And your setup may not work well against your opponent's setup. So here it's not really a setup question, it's more a question of details, right? But it does matter how you get to the setup. So one trick I'd like to talk about, and this is one that I use a lot of lessons I end up giving this advice, so I think it's very valuable, which is basically that if you see two opening developing moves, you generally want to play the more flexible of the two. Now this is not always true. There are other factors, and there are here, which we'll get into. But generally speaking, if you have a move that you want to play, so for example, bishop g7, you don't really want to play bishop h6 to trade off the bishops in most cases. So we're going to just assume you're not doing that. It actually is not like totally ridiculous, but for now, let's just assume the bishop is going to g7 for sure. So then bishop g7, you're going to play. The bishop probably wants to be on e6, but you could go to g4 conceivably. You could go to d7. This situation is not a great example of that, but a lot of the times there's a move you want to play and there's a move you're not sure. So you play the move you want to play first. This is a very, very common one. I would say bishop g7 you're going to play much higher percentage of the time than bishop e6. But there are also details like what can your opponent do? So in the game, bishop g7 would be the normal move here. It looks a little odd. Normally white has a knight here, which is actually a bit unusual and maybe threw him off, I would say. But something like this, knight e7, you castle. And what I like about this is that you're, first of all, getting castled first. I would say that in most openings, assuming you want to castle kingside, a kingside developing move will be more valuable than a queenside developing move. You're trying to get castled. That's your goal. So you don't really want to, you know, you don't really want to focus on queenside development as quickly, usually. So this would be just a very normal way to play. It's not the only way, but it's definitely the most logical to me. You castle, you might shoot for f5 one day. You might try to play a6, b5. You have all sorts of ideas, right? So the move that was played was bishop e6, and this looks very normal. But there are a couple problems. Number one, if a knight lands on d5, so for example, you could have positions where, say, this happens. And let's say white plays for this plan of playing for b4, which is very common. You could have a situation like this, and I know this is not precise, where taking this knight feels really bad because you cannot take with a knight. One thing that's kind of nice is that if you play something like this, and let's say white throws a knight in here, you always have the option of capturing and moving. So you don't have to give up your light-scored bishop, which is probably one of your better pieces. So this is one pattern that occurs quite often. Here, though, there's a more immediate problem, which was actually played in the game. White played this move, and kudos to them for really paying attention and trying to take advantage. So all of a sudden, this bishop attack, but you think no big deal? If they castle, I play h6, the knight goes back to f3, what have you achieved? But now I can play f4. And after h6, this happened, the knight goes back. It's nothing crazy, but white basically got in a pawn break for free. This is not the way you want to start off your game. So okay, white ended up getting a pretty nice advantage, and I don't know even how the game turned out, but this definitely didn't go as well for black as it could have. And you could easily avoid it by playing bishop g7. There's no reason to allow this. So these are the kind of details that people miss out on. So number one, you want to know kind of what your setup is, but you don't want to be married to it. And number two, you want to make sure that you're always aware of what your opponent's trying to do, what your opponent's possible tempo moves are, like their attacking moves, what their setups are, what they would like. A lot of the times when people are confused what to do, they're just not thinking enough about what their opponent's possible moves are. So thinking about your opponent more will definitely help you. So let's move to another example. This one actually was played by young Rose Atwell, very, very promising junior player. I like watching, games of juniors, and it's nice to just watch them, on my couch rather than having to play them in a game where it's like terrifying, It's a little easier to just watch, but this was a decision she had to make in this game. She's playing an IM from Uzbekistan, I believe. And in this game, she has to choose where to move her bishop. It's been a kind of a very, very strange opening. Just to show you how it went, it was like a Lopez, but black played here. I kind of like knight c3 against this, with the idea that if they ever kick your bishop, you go here, and they feel a little silly because now your bishop's incredibly strong. But okay, this is another time. We're not talking about theory. c3, of course, is fine, and black plays d5. d5 against c3 makes a lot of sense, because if you take and I take with the queen, your knight can no longer, oops, I can't draw arrows, can no longer defend the bishop and attack the queen. Just a couple little tidbits for you. Knight takes e5, the pawn takes, queen e2, attacking the pawn, defending the bishop. Black plays here. And she doesn't really want to grab the pawn, I think, because of this move. Still not like super clear, but it looks annoying. So she takes on c6, and here she has to make a choice of where the bishop goes. So these kind of decisions, again, occur quite often, and sometimes you have a very, very reasonable choice, but other times it actually quite matters where your pieces go. So once again, try to figure out where you're going and why. Once again, I would say that it comes down to, number one, what is going on in this position? Because this position is far more unusual than the previous example. This position is kind of crazy, right? Like black's king looks very strange and not fully developed, but you also have this queenside pieces which look kind of like donkeys. Like, what is happening with those pieces? I apologize to donkey fan, perfectly fine animal, but you get what I'm saying, right? The knight on b1, the bishop on e3, they look, bishop on e3, my goodness. The bishop on c1, they look awful, right? However, if white can open the position and take advantage of this black king, it's going to be great. But this is the key. If you play your bishop back to a4, which kind of makes sense, right? You're keeping an eye on this pawn, you're making sure the knight on e7 can't move. Black, I think, can just play here. And how on earth are these pieces getting out, right? This endgame does not look all that promising. I'm going to castle queenside if you do that. I probably have to go here and try to shoo your queen away, but this looks terrible. Like, why am I doing this? This looks like a huge pain. So, not a fan of this. Luckily for fans of Rose, she found the move bishop a6, which is a much better move. It looks like a weird square to put the bishop, but number one, the knight still has trouble moving because of bishop b7. If you try to move the knight, bishop b7 is still a thing. And very importantly, it controls this crucial square. So there's no queen d3, there's no nonsense. For what it's worth, this move would also be quite bad, because trades and queen d3, maybe queen d5 is nice, and you're not controlling these light squares. This is a huge disaster. So yeah, bishop a6 was played, and I think the position's kind of unclear, but she ended up getting a huge advantage very quickly. She got castled, put pressure on this pawn, and developed her pieces, and so now there's threats like this. And just to show you what happened, she played here and d4, and this was super nice. So notice how she's focused very much on development, and taking advantage of the fact that, you know, this piece is coming out, there's all sorts of pressure. It's going to be a pretty annoying game because black can take on Poisson, I think, and this looks like very playable. But the problem is that how are you, even if the queen were to just move, I don't know if this is the best move, I didn't analyze this precise position, but even if the queen were to just move, so say, where am I moving? Because there's this guy hanging too. Goodness gracious. This is more tactical than I realized. But even if I have to go here, okay, I'm sure this is not the best move. I'm just throwing it out there. Queen f3 looked very promising. I would have to calculate it. But even here, like, this pawn is annoying, no doubt. But look at this piece. Like, this knight's not even developed. Like, not even remotely developed. It can't get out. Like, black can't move anything. So you have this position, you're down a pawn, but good luck, right? So this was really well played, and you know, ended up getting, so black played this move instead, and then white played f3, which is a great move, cracking at this pawn. Black does not want to move this pawn, so black ended up doing this, which is horribly ugly. And I think that black actually got back in the game and has some chances now, but it was like, you know, this was clearly like, things have gone wrong for black. But the only reason this happened is because Rose took care to defend the d3 square, to get castled, and then to put pressure on the pawn. Without this decision, it would not have been possible, and it is very likely white would have ended up in a very bad position. So these decisions truly, truly matter quite a bit, and you have to be really on the ball to make sure you're looking at your opponent's ideas all the time. So let's move to the next one. This is another one, kind of a typical sort of opening, like nothing crazy is happening. It's a kind of structure you get from, I would say, like a knight d2 French with c5. You get this kind of structure quite often. It can come from other things as well. It's not from a knight d2 French because the pawn's a6. Oh, Josh, you're very funny. But anyways, but it kind of comes from lots of different openings, like different Grunfelds can kind of land here, I guess. In any case, it's less important what it comes from. It's not an uncommon structure. However, once again, we have a decision. Bishop e3 or rook d1, both moves look very logical. I don't think one move is awful, but one move I definitely think is worse than the other. And again, how do you figure it out? So try to pause your video, figure out between rook d1 and bishop e3, which move works better. So this is an interesting one because they both have a clear sort of drawback, right? So bishop e3 does allow the move knight c4. But first of all, I feel like I should mention, them taking your bishop's not the end of the world. Just throwing it out there, right? Like if you play, I don't know, rook e1 and they take, not saying this is the best way to play, but it's not actually that easy for black, right? They can play e5, you move your knight, maybe queen c5 to try to trade these, your rooks come into the game, it's not the end of the world. You do have bishop g5 as well, which is kind of sneaky. I don't know, e5 comes, it looks a little weird, but it's possible. This knight is actually a little bit oddly placed, it might get hit with a bishop or something. Hard to say, but I would say that bishop e3 would be a relatively normal move. You want to get your pieces out. Bishop e3 is a logical way to do that. Rook d1 also looks logical. However, it does not aim against black's move. So black's idea was e5, knight b3, and f5. What are you doing about this, right? So sure, you can play bishop d5 check and give up the light squared bishop for the knight. That does not look fun. I will I mean, a position like this, even just bishop e6 or something, the rook comes out, like this looks terrible. Yeah, and this could have happened in the game. It actually didn't, which I thought was really strange, but this looks just really bad. Like, white can play here is maybe what I thought would happen. And now I guess the use of this square was annoying, so I thought this move made sense. The idea being to just block the knight out of here. I mean, allowing these pawns up for free looks really bad. So the question is, does bishop e3 stop this or not? Not really. Like, black can still play it. However, here you have additional options. And one of them, I mentioned this bishop I care about a lot less. You can do this and bring your queen out, for example, and bring your rook out and maybe try to trade. These pawns are moving up the board, but they're not hurting you too bad, right? You have a beautiful bishop on d5. You have control over the center. White's doing okay, I think, you know? But notice how you have to be aware of what your opponent's intention is. It's so easy to just play an improving move, but if you don't think, what is my opponent going to do, you're going to get hit with these pawns, and then all of a sudden you're going to get into a bad position really fast. And it's kind of what happened in a roundabout way in the game. That black got these pawns f5, e4, it just became really unpleasant. So once again, it's kind of like, it's easy to just kind of come up with a developing move in a setup, but if you see your opponent's plan, what are they trying to do, you're going to be much more accurate with your opening play. It's just such a huge part of how it works. So the next one I wanted to look at was actually a top board game. This was between Wander Liang is white and oh my goodness. Oh, it's even a friend of mine. I can't remember. Oh man. Oh, it's terrible. Anyways, he's playing a GM. White's a GM. When I look at the games, I'm really like not as cognizant of the players a lot of the time. I'm really focused on the positions, as you can probably tell. In any case, he was white. Yeah, Wonder was white. Now the GM is black, and black has to make kind of a tricky choice. So Wonder is obviously sacrificed the light square bishop, but is kind of running pawns over here. And black has to make a decision. Do they try to like improve the knight, bring the knight to the center, or do you bring the bishop out to g4 to activate the bishop first and pin the knight? So once again, it's kind of it's another typical sort of, this is a little bit after the opening, but close enough to the opening where I feel like this is counts as an opening decision. What do you do? And again, a lot of it is figuring out what is going on in the position, right? What is happening here, and how do you play? So this is one I kind of see wrong a lot. Like really a lot. Which is that it looks like a move like bishop g4 looks very logical, and this happened in the game. I was actually amazed that this was played. I assume there was a miscalculation involved, because there's no way this is actually what he was trying to do. But bishop g4 looks very logical, pinning the knight. By itself, it's probably not such a bad move, because after h3 you can move back, I don't know, d7 I guess, but it looks weird, right? Like we would never do that. So you could take the knight, but that's obviously not the intention either. And after bishop h5, knight g3, and the problem is you can't move back because this pawn hangs. So you have to give up your bishop. And what you've succeeded in doing is trading off your bishop for the knight. And now, to be perfectly honest, your position looks really bad. Like, this knight is very active. This pawn is ready to come up and start putting pressure. And this kind of happened in the game, and white got an enormous advantage very quickly. Again, I assume there was a miscalculation involved. There's no way this was the intention. But in any case, like, it is kind of important, right? Because bishop g4, imagine how easy it is to play a move like that on autopilot. To just put your bishop on g4, you're pinning the knight, it looks nice and active, but you're not thinking about what your opponent is doing. If there's any really common theme to these opening decisions, it is if you're not aware of what your opponent's moves are going to be, you're going to make poor decisions. And what's kind of cool here is that after knight g6, I think black's position is pretty good. Like, I would probably take black here because, first of all, like, these knights look kind of okay, annoying, but you have the nice central space advantage. At some point, you're going to probably start some attack, like h6, maybe f5 if you're feeling intrepid or something, but your knight may land on f4, you can start attacking these light squares. It looks very scary for white to me. There are moves like a5, and it's easy to kind of get scared off of things like this, but I think you can even just go here. Sure, white can take, but there's nothing really tragic occurring here. Your bishop maybe goes to b7 now, for example, h6, eventually f5. You can see how all your pieces are getting lined up. And what's nice about the knight on g6 is it really secures this pawn. And if white ever plays a move like g3, then you really have to be careful of the bishop landing on b7 or g4, pinning the knight. Like, it gets very scary very quickly. So I don't think white wants to play g3, but if they don't, then this knight on g6 is often hopping into the game very rudely. So I don't know. I feel like this, and this is the money game. This is top board. Awanders white, played kind of an odd opening, I guess. I mean, not that. Like, it was a little weird to me. It looked weird. But probably it wasn't that bad. But they get to this position, and I think if black plays knight g6, black's the one who's trying to win. Whereas after bishop g4, I think that Awander got a great position. And last I looked, should have been winning. I don't know if he actually won the game. But I thought that this was just such a big moment. It was a big money game between two GMs. And it was just this one little detail in the opening really cost black the game in a sense. Even though this wasn't the losing move per se, it went from a nice position for black to a nice position for white in one move. So the main thing I would gather from from these examples, I chose wildly different openings. I really chose from just this. I kind of got, I don't want to say inspired exactly, but I kind of got the idea for this video when I was watching, the games and how things were unfolding. And a lot of these games were really, a lot of how the game progressed was built on that opening decision. So it's often a decision there where you have really a couple different ways to go about things. Some decisions are not a huge deal. Like I would say in the first example, right? It's very early in the game. Bishop e6 is not some blunder, right? It's still perfectly playable. But you're giving white an easy option to get play, which you do not have to allow. Sticking with the more flexible bishop g7, which doesn't allow the tempo move, just much easier. In this one, it's really about, it's a weird position, right? After b takes c. This is such an unusual position with the black king in the center, the pawn on e4 being both a strength and a weakness, white potentially being able to build an initiative. Where you put the bishop is so important because of how the position is structured, right? The number of auto moves I see in the opening is really astounding, and in these situations, you really have to make the right one. This one, again, a position that looks so innocuous, but when you realize what black's plan is, your move should directly fight against that in some way, regardless of how you do it. I'm sure bishop e3 is not the only move. I would consider knight b3 here, for example. But the point is, you want to be aware of what your opponent's idea is, and when it actually becomes easier to play for you, because your move, unless you can do something really great, should probably deal with what your opponent wants to do in some way, especially if they want to do something quite strong, like launch their central pawns. Your ideas should combat theirs. When you start thinking about openings in terms of a battle of ideas, you want to do a certain thing, they want to do a certain thing, how do you interfere with each other while still completing your own ideas, etc. When you think of openings that way, it becomes a lot more clear what you have to do. When you think about openings in terms of this is the setup I want and my opponent can kind of do whatever, it makes things easier for you in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to find yourself making lots of inaccuracies, sometimes bigger mistakes, and getting into trouble a lot. And it's very exploitable as well. So having the attitude of what is my opponent trying to do, what is their setup, how can I structure my setup against theirs, is very big. Whereas in this final position, this was actually just a major decision to be made, and not anticipating how the opponent would react to a move, and based on your setup, based on, and I'm sure that, these two GMs, I'm sure they both have knowledge of how these structures work. But one careless move can just throw a position away entirely, and it can just put you on the back foot. Getting a bad opening position can just make a whole game miserable sometimes, especially if you're playing at a higher level. But even if you're, two amateur players, you can get back in the game more easily, but it's still kind of terrible to have some bad position out of the opening, or, blow a position you should be better. So, practicing these kind of decisions, looking at some games like I was doing, that's one of the ways I practice, looking at games, trying to make decisions, trying to figure out what is this about, what is going on here. It's a great way to improve at any opening you play. You can improve this way, and just learning not to make decisions on autopilot is such a huge factor. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you like my teaching style and everything else, definitely check out my Chessable courses. I linked them below. And otherwise, have a good one, guys.